My parents converted to Islam from Christianity in 1971. Like most Black converts of that era, they joined Islam through a Black liberation movement called the Nation of Islam. It taught that Islam was the original religion of their ancestors and that converting would restore to African Americans the noble identity that was stripped from them in slavery. My parents married shortly after converting, and by the time I was born, they had come to identify with the global community of Muslims. That means Muslims from Senegal, Somalia, Morocco, Egypt, India, Pakistan, and Malaysia, to name a few Muslim countries. But I wouldn't truly experience the richness I lived a very unique Black American cultural expression of Islam in a very vibrant and loving community in Atlanta, Georgia. Now, fast forward to the present. This is a picture of a Muslim woman in Cameroon, West Africa. By the way, she is a billionaire in her. First, let me just say, how come this isn't the image of Africa that we see in the media? There's a backstory to how I came across this picture. Just a few nights ago, I stood in the courtyard of a mosque in Medina Bay, a small town, but also a religious or an international religious center in Senegal, where I have been living since January, taking a spiritual retreat from life in the US. Stood next to me as we both waited for our spiritual guide, a Senegalese sheikh, to exit the mosque. The young man, also in Medina Bay for spiritual renewal, exchanged contact info with me, and this photo came up as his WhatsApp profile picture, a picture of his stunningly beautiful mother. He noticed my profile pic immediately too. This slide of the two of us side by side, two Black Muslim women, the exact same age, but from two very different worlds, capture some of what I hope to impart tonight or this morning. It's nighttime here. The appeal of Islam and the events while winning women's hearts. The setting of the magical Medina Bay Mosque courtyard, which includes the mausoleum that you see on the left of the slide, is a great work on how African American Muslim women love and live Islam, navigating Islamic gender rules and norms in light of family, community, and work. Here in Medina Bay, experiencing Islam lived in a culture different from my own, it is as though I am seeing Islam with new eyes, very much like a convert. And interestingly, the women whom I center in my research are converts, formerly Christian women who came to Islam. Black Christian women, in contrast to white women, have always demonstrated a unique ability to see beauty in Islam. And what's so striking is that what I see of Islam with fresh eyes and what I love about Medina Bay parallels much of what Black Christian women have found appealing about Islam in America. I've captured what I love through three things, all of them most vividly experienced in the sacred space of the mosque. Hands down, what I love the most about the mosque complex in Medina Bay Senegal is that young Black men dominate the space. Women are there and are highly visible, but men outnumber them by far. In the slide is a picture at the tombs, which women frequent. And if you look closely on the right end, you can see a woman in a yellow hijab sitting among other women. Also, notice the man standing in blue with the white scarf. Senegalese men regularly wear this covering that looks like a hijab and in various colors. Now, as someone who occasionally identifies as an Islamic feminist, it might be surprising to hear that I love the way men hold most of the sacred space. Perhaps this paradox is the perfect place to pose an important question. Whose definition of women's liberation are we using to judge Islam? Whose story are we telling? Is it Muslim women's story, Black women's? Neither. It is white Christian women's. White women are the ones who have crafted the dominant narrative of women's liberation in this country. Because white women's place had been in the home, liberation for them meant breaking out of domestic confines and gaining equal access to jobs and wages, as well as other public spaces led by men. Indeed, this sounds like freedom, but in reality, it has not been for Black women. Unlike white women, African American women have had much more to worry about than discrimination based on gender. Black women have told a very different story of women's liberation. Racism affects our lives so profoundly and pervasively that we cannot effectively address sexism without addressing racism. I appreciate the way that activist and poet Nikki Giovanni captures this difference in the stories of feminism, where Black women were not even seen as a female body to be protected, but rather a Black body to be exploited. Giovanni stated, when we look at the history of slavery, we have a whole situation where no one cared if you were a woman or not. You had to get out into the field. After freedom, no one cared if you were a woman or not. You had to work to support your family. So that's one of the problems with women's lib in relation to Black women. They look at themselves as women, but we've had to look at ourselves as Black. Giovanni is right to begin with slavery to understand why Black and white women see feminism differently. Black women's beginnings in this country were defined by unrelenting work for white people. Washing, ironing, cooking, scrubbing, sewing, mending, hoeing, plowing, digging, planting, pruning, patching, to borrow words from Margaret Walker's famous poem, For My People. Jacqueline Jones, in her book, Labor of Love, Labor of Sorrow, Black Women Work in the Family, notes that sun up to sundown is the expression commonly used to describe the work hours of the enslaved. For Black women, it was dawn to midnight. After tending the fields, they began their night work for their own families and communities. All this means that going to work is not the meaning of liberation for Black women. Black women have always worked. What I have discovered among Black Christian women across generations is that they assess Islam based on their own stories of women's liberation, shaped primarily by racism. Black women are sensitive to the ways in which racism functions as a broader injustice that infects an entire community, women, men, and children. Hence, our feminism also takes into account how racism has affected Black men and how that affects our lives as women. So take, for instance, my intro to Islam students at Spelman, a historically Black college for women. I had them visit a mosque and report their observations. Again and again, these young Black Christian women noted the men and how abundantly present they were. One student described the men in the mosque as a beautiful sight to see and noted so many young ones. She wrote, it was beautiful to see so many Black males peacefully gathered together, shaking hands and greeting each other with respect and love. Their unity opposes the popular media images that convey that Black men are divided. The women notice the men because their experience is that women dominate men in the church. Across denomination, women make up over 60% of church congregants. Young single men are even less likely to attend church. The predominance of men in the mosque has to do with the gendered rule in Islam. Muslim men are required to attend the Friday congregational prayer, whereas it is optional for women. In the mosque where I grew up, which is in the slide, men make up 60% of the Friday congregants, the opposite of the church. Since I grew up accustomed to men attending the mosque in large numbers, I was not expecting men's presence in the mosque to be the big deal that it was for some of my students. However, when I traveled to Medina by synagogue, I understood fully their delight with Black men's sizable presence in sacred space. In the sacred spaces of Medina Bay, I see a flood of Black men around the clock as worshipers and lovers of God and Prophet Muhammad. Several cultural markers here amplify their spirituality, including their dress, which is modest, often regal, fitting for the divine. They're always carrying dhikr beads, which you see in the photo. The man is holding white dhikr beads, which are used for daily devotions, and their constant presence in sacred space, no matter the time of day or night. But also, I know that my pleasure with men's predominance in this space has to do with how Black men are portrayed in the media, similar to the way the Spelman student highlighted that seeing Black males peacefully gathered together opposes popular media images. Indeed, to see Black men not as bodily threats, the way they see them in America, but as spiritual aspirants is relief to my eyes, and I must say, satisfaction to my soul. This is so because the demonizing images of Black men and boys has a huge emotional impact on our hearts as women who fear that our husbands or brothers will be victims of police brutality, or our sons among the 1 out of 3 Black boys who will one day be incarcerated, all because Black males are assumed guilty the instant they see them. Because my heart and soul yearn to see Black men in their best image as servants of God, to see young men flood the sacred spaces of Medina Bay takes on extraordinarily positive meaning for me. The gender rule that has resulted in men's larger presence in the mosque is related to 2 other gender rules in Islam that essentially position men as leaders over women. The rule that only men can lead the congregational prayer, and the obligation for men, not women, to financially support their families. Of course, these both align with Christianity and have also made Islam very attractive to Black women. One convert expressed, that attracted me that women were not being directed to go out and take care of the family. When you are in a hard situation, you are definitely being prepared to take care of yourself and work side by side with the man. But you don't want to have to do that if you don't have to. So Islam offered an option for women. And for our ethnic group, that was like what we wanted to hear. It was what Black women wanted to hear because, as discussed earlier, Black women have always been in a hard situation in this country. And as a result, have always been side by side with men in every realm and regularly leaders ahead of men, surpassing them in both worldly and spiritual pursuits. As is the case with Black Christian women, most Black Muslim women work outside the home and assume an equal or larger share of work in their mosque communities, serving as directors of community schools, editors of newspapers, and organizers of mosque fundraisers. Precisely because Black women have been in the forefront all their lives, they find appeal in a religion that pushes men to be leaders and makes optional for women the family leadership and community involvement that they are accustomed to, particularly in the church. One woman expressed, I just love men's leadership because this is a natural role that they are supposed to take. And it's so comfortable to be able to have leadership like that because we as women have experienced having to be the head of the household and having to make all decisions and work and distribute the money, doing all that. And men are supposed to have that kind of leadership in the community. So I love it. For Black women, women's liberation is the freedom from having to do it all, including traditionally men's work. The second theme connecting what I love about Islam in Senegal with Black American Muslim women is eye-catching but modest dress. I call the woman in this slide Muslim Cinderella. This picture was taken on a Friday morning at the Tombs. Here in Senegal, men and women dress up all the time, every day, and especially in sacred space. Culturally, Senegalese dress up not to show off, but to show their respect for others. Similar to how in American culture, we dress up for important people or special occasions. The difference perhaps is that in a Sunni, or rather a Sufi Muslim culture like Senegal, where saints, or the friends of God, as Muslims call them, are abundant and everywhere, it is fitting to dress up all the time. Also, as Sufism teaches, one never really knows whether or not a person is a friend of God. So every encounter is one to show respect and dress well. Senegalese women wear the most vibrant colors and striking patterns, which defies the conservative norm that women should ideally wear neutral, solid colors. Donning head wraps and wide scarves that match their dresses, Senegalese women gracefully show that modesty rules in Islam do not diminish style or beauty. Similarly, Black American women have navigated Islamic modesty rules in ways that make piety look fashionable and desirable. But before forging their own fashion, just the look of piety attracted many Black women to Islam. And again, the reason piety appealed to them goes back to slavery. From the beginning, Black women were stereotyped as innately promiscuous to deny them the protection that white women were afforded and to justify the systematic violence against them. So even before coming to Islam, Black women, or when Black women put on a long dress, they were doing more than covering their bodies. They were demanding respect as they fought against stereotypes of them as sexually loose, essentially attempting to protect themselves. Muslim modesty fashioned a new type of respect, even from their own men. One woman stated, "The Nation of Islam gave me some awareness that there were a group of men who respected women who covered and who called Black women queens and all these other beautiful things that we didn't hear in the streets at that time." African American women easily embraced modesty, but now met the challenge of making it their own. The dominant image of Muslim women's modesty in the 1960s was the Nation of Islam's women's uniform, which borrowed symbols of purity from Christianity, the faith closest to home. As you can see, the uniform resembles the head covering of nuns. By the mid-1970s, there were two relevant developments. One, the Nation of Islam abandoned its Black liberation teachings for global Islam, forming the largest national community of African American Muslims. And two, an influx of Muslim immigrants from Asia and Africa brought their own cultural forms of Islam to America. Imam Wardi Muhammad, the leader of the transformed Black Muslim community, discontinued the women's uniform and encouraged women to come up with dress styles that were Americanized in contrast to dress Muslim immigrants brought from their home countries. The two hijab styles that evolved were the scarf tied around the back and the African head wrap. By the way, hijab is more of an immigrant Muslim term. I grew up calling the covering a scarf. Even in the Nation of Islam, women wore the scarf loosely tied with bangs slipping through the front. Over time, the scarf without bangs and the head wrap dominated as the most popular hair covering. But the presence of Muslim immigrants inspired a range of hijab looks. One sister expressed, "We had the Senegalese sisters with all their headwear on, and then we had a lot of the immigrant sisters from Pakistan and Egypt. So the khimar, or scarf wrapped or draped around the neck, came in and sisters were doing that beautifully. We had so many influences that you could pretty much come up with any style. And then we had African American sisters who were designers coming up and developing their own fashion wear for sisters of African American background so that they have their own expression." American clothes, either store-bought or handmade, eventually predominated as the style that came to characterize Black Muslim women. Short dresses over pants is one example of what women came up with in buying clothes at the store. One woman recalled this look as very attractive. This dedication to American Muslim dress styles made fashion shows popular in Black Muslim communities. They served as fundraisers for communities and a means to support Black women-owned businesses. But perhaps the greatest impact of the shows was making the younger generation of American Muslims excited about covering. When I reached my teens, the last thing I wanted to do was cover my hair. Unlike the women of my mother's generation, who wanted a new identity in light of the stereotypes of African Americans and wanted to be seen as different, hence taking on new dress, similar to the way they took on new names, The women of my generation wanted to fit in with their Christian peers and look attractive, which meant showing our hair. Realizing this, the women organizing our mosque annual fashion show in Atlanta recruited teen models and speakers for a youth portion of the show. In May 1993, a reporter for the Atlanta Journal and Constitution captured their effort to nurture among young women a strong emotional attachment to beautiful Muslim dress. In this picture, the Muslim teens wear African garments. One of the women is my sister, Aisha Karim. Amira Wazir, the show's organizer and commentator, was quite convincing to the old and young crowd, making proclamations like this: "We are trendsetters. Europeans have copied Islamic design. We have influenced the garment industry to the point that Islamic style is in. Headwear is in. What we have been doing for years is now vogue." Interestingly, this is one of the photos in the February 2020 issue of Vogue magazine. This model is a Somali Muslim woman, but with that headpiece, she certainly looks like a woman in the Nation of Islam. The legacy of Muslim women's efforts to make their daughters not only feel beautiful, but also fit in as Americans in hijab is most noticed and celebrated through Ibtihaj Muhammad, the first American woman to wear a hijab while competing at the Olympic Games. It was her mother determined to have her daughters compete in sports while still covering, who spotted girls fencing at a high school and directed Ibtihaj to the sport that would make her famous, and eventually led to Barbie making its first doll with a hijab. African American women, like Ibtihaj's mother, Denise, on the left, not only came to Islam because it presented an alternative image of Black women, but also in living out Islam, contributed something new and beautiful to American culture. And in this slide, she is with my mother, Marjorie Karim, on the right. Finally, I wanted to share this photo of Jada Pinkett Smith. I think it proves that Black American women have a special cultural sensitivity to feel quite comfortable with Islam and in hijab. The third theme connecting what I love in Medina Bay with Black American Muslim women at home is soft gender boundaries between men and women in sacred space. In this slide is a picture of men and women in the Medina Bay Mosque courtyard during the Friday congregational prayer. Mosque in general requires some form of gender boundaries because the Muslim prayer ritual requires bodies to touch. However, the traditional etiquette is to limit physical contact, even handshakes between men and women who are not related. This means that men pray next to men and women next to women, with the men praying in the front, or rare cases where the groups pray side by side. Unlike dress, gender boundaries do not attract women to Islam. In fact, the concept of praying behind the men is foreign and strange to many women initially. At the same time, it is not a common deterrent, and women eventually understand and agree that it is a practical way to uphold modesty and respect. Women ultimately prefer not to bow and prostrate in front of men. Although gender boundaries are not what attract Black women to Islam, the way that they navigate them is another example of how they carve out their own cultural expression of Islam. There are extreme cases of gender boundaries where the mosque is not even considered a place for women. And some immigrant women to the United States never attended a mosque in their home country for this reason. Mosques in the US, however, are generally places for women, but the vast majority of immigrant mosques have a curtain or barrier separating men and women. Most African American mosques do not have a gender barrier, but some do because of immigrant influences, primarily Arab and South Asian. Consider these words by a Black American woman resisting this practice. I don't go to mosques where they got these rags dividing the men from the women. How dare an African American imam divide his woman from a man by putting a partition or rag up? I don't dare go to a mosque where I gotta sit behind a rag like I'm some inferior being. And here I have come through slavery. I've come across the Atlantic with you on the slave ship, picked cotton with you in the field, saved you from master's whipping and hanging you, and you're gonna put me behind a rag because a foreigner comes across the water and tells you that's the setup? Oh no, not me. I ain't having it. Initially, the mosque in Medina Bay, built in the 1930s, did not have a barrier between the men and women, but was put up in 2008 for political reasons, not cultural. Culturally, men and women are comfortable with soft, fluid gender arrangements, more fluid than anything I've seen in the United States. And this is demonstrated in the mosque courtyard, where worshipers can hear everything that goes on inside the masjid through the loudspeakers. In this picture, on one side of the courtyard, women always stand at the front. In other areas outside, women sit behind the men, but their space seems to softly flow into the men's. And here's an example of what I mean. There is a woman, then two boys, and then a man with glasses and a mask. They're all in the same row. In the tombs, where space is tighter, we find even more intimacy between men and women. I sit in a space outside the masjid that is dominated by men. And this is during the Maghrib prayer, so that's why it's starting to get dark in these photos. Men usually sit alongside the wall, but not shown in this photo. Many nights I have been the only woman in the space. From this spot, you can see into the mosque door and the area where the muezzin calls the prayer and the imam leads the prayer. And I like the spot for that reason. I realized that I have become the African American women I wrote about 20 years ago in my first book, women who thoughtfully and effectively carved a space out for themselves in male-dominated mosque spaces. In my book, I quoted a woman named Zakiya, who on occasion visited an immigrant mosque where the women pray separately on the lower level. It's not Islam, Zakiya said, to put the sisters in the basement. That's not Islam. When I first moved here in 94, I was too scared to go on the other side where they are serving food where the brothers were. But now after Juma, I walk right over there. Like Zakiya, initially I did not go into this space because I did not see women there, but finally found a way and a place there. The men have warmly welcomed me. I will end this talk with pictures taken in the last 2 days. Medina Bay's largest spiritual gathering is happening right now, which makes it quite a miracle that I am here with you because there is a mini religious pilgrimage beyond these doors or this wall. The birthday of the Prophet Muhammad, called Maulid, will be celebrated tonight. During Maulid season, there are long lines to get into the tombs. And this was just a Fajr prayer yesterday morning. Here we see an attempt to separate men and women, but once inside the tombs, this is impossible. In the beginning of Maulid season, which starts at the beginning of Rabi al-Awwal, which is the birth month of the Prophet Muhammad, women take over the space that I normally sit by myself, especially women pilgrims from Mauritania, which borders at the north of Senegal. But as more guests arrive, even the men spill out into this space. Again, notice the soft gender boundaries. More guests arrive, and this was yesterday, men take over the space. But women still. Here, a woman joins a men's dhikr or prayer circle formed within the larger crowd. I sit right next to this circle taking the photo. Here is the same woman at a different angle. Note that she is sitting exactly where I sat when I was the only woman. Behind these three women lies a whole section of women. And my very last slide was a picture that I was very excited to take yesterday, right after the Maghrib prayer, the sunset prayer, because I had been looking for an image again of the way that men and women kind of naturally flow into each other's space. And the crowd is just so large that here you have a photo of a woman and a man sitting right next to each other. And I'm pretty sure they were not related. And as many of you know, maybe most of you probably wouldn't know, but the Hajj is very similar to this, which is very interesting because we know Saudi Arabia itself is a very conservative Muslim country where men and women are separated in very extreme ways. But just because of the sheer crowd and number of people on the Hajj, it is impossible to really kind of direct the space or to impose these gender boundaries all the time. So you also find this kind of soft, these soft fluid gender boundaries. And I will end there. Thank you.